Nama saya Sita. Saya menghabiskan waktu saya sejak remaja untuk mencari orang paling berdosa. Kalau agama benar dan manusia akan mendapatkan balasan sesuai dengan apa yang dia lakukan di dunia, orang yang saya cari itu pasti akan mendapatkan siksa di dalam kubur. Dan saya ingin menyaksikannya.
Orang ini siapa sih?
Orang paling kejam yang pernah aku kenal.
After Wahyu's death, his family requests that the news of his passing remain private, and asks the nursing home to handle the funeral arrangements. At the cemetery, desperate to prove that the idea of divine judgment and grave torture is a fabrication, Sita literally enters Wahyu's grave and lies beside his corpse. Adil, assisting her, gives her an infrared camera to record in the dark and tells her to shout if she needs help, as he can hear her through a pipe that reaches the surface. Once Sita is inside, Adil covers the grave with soil, and Sita begins recording while lying next to Wahyu's corpse. It is nighttime, and Adil waits outside when a snake, often seen as a symbol of the damned, slithers toward the grave. Inside, Sita notices that the pipe is blocked with soil, cutting off her link to the surface. Startled by the snake, Adil becomes increasingly anxious. Sita sets the camera aside to continue recording in case something happens. The scene shifts to the next morning when Adil uncovers the grave and helps Sita out. Sita is still alive and reviews the footage, but they find nothing out of the ordinary, despite their expectations. Adil hands her the memory card, asking if she still intends to release the footage publicly. Does this imply that Sita didn't witness grave torture? Yet, after the experiment, Sita begins experiencing unsettling supernatural events. The question lingers, did she truly leave the grave alive, or is she now trapped in an afterlife she cannot fully comprehend? One night, as Sita prepares a bed for an elderly person, she recalls a conversation where the man mentioned that his daughter could invite her onto a TV show. Later, on the show, Sita exposes Wahyu, publicly declaring that if religion and divine punishment truly exist, Wahyu Sutama would be one of the first to be tortured. She reveals that she had been buried alongside him to witness the event firsthand. Sita then asks the producer to play the video she had provided as evidence. When the recording begins, Sita is stunned to see that it's not the footage she submitted. Panicked, she rushes to the producer, insisting that the memory card being used is not the one she gave him. She accuses him of swapping the card and demands to know how much Wahyu's children paid him to suppress the real footage. The producer, however, denies the accusation and insists that the card is indeed hers, handing it back to her. Upon closer inspection, Sita realizes it is the same memory card that Adil had given her at the graveyard. Sita then confronts Adil, accusing him of switching the memory card. Adil denies it, expressing frustration over always being dragged into her issues. He then shifts the blame to Sita, accusing her of being responsible for their parents' deaths. According to Adil, if Sita hadn't told their father about the thieves, their parents would still be alive. Defending herself, Sita argues that everything she is doing is for their parents and for him. Later, while Sita is deep in thought, she suddenly hears Wahyu calling her name, startling her. Horrified, she rushes to his room to check, but finds it empty. As she turns to leave and closes the door, she hears Wahyu calling her name again. Nervously, she reopens the door and looks around, only to spot a demonic figure standing in the corner of the room. When she steps inside to investigate, the figure vanishes. Sita notices trace of soil scattered on Wahyu's table, and as Wahyu's voice calls her name once more, she catches sight of a demonic hand pressing against the window. However, when she goes to inspect it, no one is there. Suddenly, a demonic figure gestures in a direction, leading Sita to discover Nanny standing nearby in distress. Alarmed, Sita rushes over and asks Nanny what's wrong. Nanny, with anguish in her voice, reveals that her husband is cheating on her in that very room. She goes to the room and is shocked to find Pundi with Nurse Lani. Pundi emerges from the room and apologizes to Nanny, but she tells him to stay away from her. Uncertain about how to deal with the situation, Sita advises Pundi to give Nanny space and let her process her emotions. However, Pundi responds, saying that Nanny shouldn't be left to handle things alone, as she is careless and clumsy. When Nanny returns to her room, she is overcome with distress. She soils her own gown and then throws up, overwhelmed by the betrayal and emotional turmoil. Nanny then goes to the laundry room to wash her dress, placing it inside the washing machine. Suddenly, she realizes that her wedding ring is missing and suspects it may have fallen into the machine along with the dress. Desperate to find it, she leans inside the machine and searches frantically. As she tries to climb out, she accidentally turns on the switch, activating the machine. The drum begins to spin, trapping her with half of her body still inside the washing machine. Although the machine eventually stops, Nanny's hair gets caught in the spinning mechanism. She struggles to free herself, but the machine jerks violently, pulling her hair, and eventually the skin on her face, into the drum, leading to her tragic and agonizing death. Later, as Pundi mourns his wife's tragic death, Sita is startled by hearing Wahyu calling her name again. Confused and uneasy, she heads to the laundry to check, where a demonic figure appears and Sita jolts from her sleep, feeling deeply unsettled. Hearing Pundi's anguished cries, Sita rushes to his room, where he, filled with regret, confesses that he needs to apologize before he dies, as he longs for peace. Moved by his desperation, Sita approaches Juwita, who is known for claiming to communicate with the dead. Sita, skeptical but wanting to help Pundi, asks Juwita for her assistance. Juwita, aware of Sita's lack of faith in religion and the supernatural, warns that belief is the key. You won't be able to see if you don't believe. Determined, Sita responds, I'll believe it when I see it with my own eyes. Can you help me? Juwita agrees and begins a seance, calling upon wandering spirits with unfinished business. She specifically reaches out to Nani's spirit, telling her that her husband has something to say. Suddenly, a chilling gust of wind blows through the room, and Juwita collapses. When she speaks again, it is in Nani's voice, addressing Pundi. Overcome with emotion, Pundi begins to apologize, and pleading for her forgiveness, saying his soul will never rest if she doesn't absolve him. Nani's voice responds coldly, telling him that they will never see each other again, not even in the afterlife, unless he kills the women who seduced him. Alarmed by the sinister turn of events, Sita interjects, saying, This isn't right. Juwita, still channeling Nani's voice, responds cryptically, You can see without your eyes, Sita, if only you believe. The room is filled with chanting, urging Sita to let go of her doubt. Hesitantly, Sita closes her eyes, and to her horror, she begins to see everyone in the room, and sitting right next to her is Nani's spirit. Terrified, Sita panics, abruptly opening the curtains and announcing, It's time for lunch, in an effort to break the trance. The others begin leaving, but just as they do, Sita hears Adil calling her name. She freezes, only to realize that it is Juwita speaking in Adil's voice. Through Juwita, Adil says he is scared and begs her to help Ismail. Sita then calls Adil to check on him, who tells her that he is working. In the morgue, Adil prepares to bathe a corpse, stepping over to the locker to retrieve his apron. Behind him, unnoticed, the corpse rises to a standing position. When Adil turns back, he is horrified to find the table empty. His heart races as he bolts to the door, only to find it locked. As silence thickens, he glances around and sees the corpse walking. Paralyzed with fear, he scrambles into his locker to hide. After a few tense moments, he cautiously peeks out, only to be met with the ghastly sight of the corpse looming right before him. He then comes face to face with two more bodies while trapped, and his screams echo through the room as the scene cuts. One night as Sita and Lani are working in the laundry, Pundi suddenly attacks Lani with a knife, but Sita quickly intervenes, saving Lani. Sita shuts the door, and advises Lani to run. However, as Lani runs, Hadi stabs her with a knife, leaving her wounded. Lani collapses, and a shocked Sita exclaims she will call an ambulance, but Lani refused, stating living is exhausting anyway, and in a moment of despair, she repeatedly stabs herself to end her suffering faster. Hadi declares that Lani is an adulterer and that adulterers must be punished for their sins. He further adds that grave torture exists, which means hell exists too, and he doesn't want to suffer in his grave. On the verge of losing her sanity, Sita cries out, "Who said grave torture exists?" To which he simply points outside. Rushing outside, Sita is overwhelmed to find breaking news about teenagers who recorded grave torture. One teenager explains that their curiosity was piqued after a nursing home worker dismissed it as a lie, and now their footage supposedly proves otherwise. Stunned, Sita switches channels, discovering all the news outlets are reporting the same story, with spiritual leaders thanking her as the belief in grave torture spreads widely among the public. Juwita tells Sita that the world has changed because of her. Sita responds in frustration. How could a wretched man like Wahyu lie peacefully in his grave, avoiding grave torture? The discoveries others have made directly contradict her own findings on grave torture, challenging her obsessive quest to debunk religious myths. Enraged, she heads to the graveyard and starts digging up Wahyu's grave, only to discover that his body is missing. And suddenly she falls into the grave as it starts to collapse, almost burying her alive. Desperate to save herself, she begins digging a hole and calls out for Adil to help her. After a frantic struggle, she manages to crawl through a small opening, only to find herself back in the tunnel she and Adil had crossed earlier. Convincing herself that it is just a hallucination and determined to find a way out, she advances forward. Suddenly, she hears a quiet sobbing, and asks, "Who's there?" The voice answers, Ismail, appearing beside her and begging for her help. Terrified, she flees, and after running for a while, she finds Adil crying as he bathes a corpse. Confused seeing Adil there, she approaches him calling him out, but he doesn't respond. Just as she draws closer, she hears Adil call her name from behind, and the corpse in front of her shouts, "Don't you see?" causing Sita to panic and flee in terror. Sita is now trapped in a terrifying nightmarish realm, where the souls of the damned suffer eternal torment. After a while, she suddenly finds herself back in her bakery, reflecting on the events leading up to her parents' death. She realizes that their fate was beyond her control, and that in her obsession with uncovering the truth, she had never truly grieved their loss. In a strange way, her journey through the tunnel has allowed her to say goodbye to them. Returning to the tunnel, she encounters a group of children, likely all victims of Wahyu's torture, pleading for her help, with Ismail among them. She asks how she can save them and suddenly remembers Juwita's words that she doesn't need eyes to see, she just has to believe. Sita closes her eyes, and in the next moment, she sees an exit. With the cries of help echoing through the tunnel, she cautiously approaches Ismail's spirit, who asks her why she left him, saying he is scared. Sita asks who he is afraid of, Ismail then points upwards. To her horror, she sees a demonic Wahyu crawling towards them. Grabbing Ismail's hand, she runs away with Wahyu in pursuit. After a tense chase, Ismail suddenly stops and directs her to leap into a dark pit. He thanks her for helping him and assures her that there will be no more victims after this. As Wahyu approaches with a sinister laugh, Sita panics, sprinting toward the pit and leaping in, only to land back inside the grave with Wahyu's body beside her. Terrified of being trapped in this dark realm, she cries out for Adil's help. Just as she nears a pipe for escape, a snake suddenly appears and falls onto her. It crawls over to Wahyu's body, and Sita watches in horror as the snake slithers into his mouth. Horrified, Sita instinctively grabs her camera and starts recording the unfolding nightmare. Through the lens, she captures the terrifying moment as Wahyu's corpse reanimates, sitting up with an eerie stare. The grave then begins to shake violently as if the earth underneath is trying to consume her alive. A demonic voice booms as Wahyu's face is brutally smashed by a mace, blood spraying over Sita's face, making the horror feel all too real. Frozen in horror, she watches as Wahyu's face painfully reforms, only to be shattered repeatedly, creating an endless torment. As the torture continues, a massive multi-headed snake then starts relentlessly attacking his face, yet each time, Wahyu's face restores itself only to endure further punishment. Then an angelic figure, though cloaked in a demonic guise, perhaps the angel Munker and Naker, appears and coldly demands, "Who is your god?" At this sight, Sita's skepticism dissolves as she realizes that Siksa Kubur is real, and the torment Wahyu endures may await her as well. Sita begins to feel an urgent need to repent, haunted by the possibility of facing a similar fate. Wahyu's soul screams in agony as the angel continues to inflict relentless punishment. Meanwhile, Sita hears Adil's voice chanting prayers, seeking forgiveness for all sins, and she joins him, pleading for mercy and forgiveness. Eventually, Adil uncovers the grave, but we see a snake bite on his neck, who helps Sita escape, just as the grave collapses behind them, burying Wahyu in unending torment. As they make their way out of the graveyard, a voice rings out, chilling Sita to her core, asking, "Who is your god?" In the final scene, Nani, wearing her wedding ring, closes Wahyu's video on his phone. She and Mr. Pundi are still together. The film leaves Sita's fate ambiguous but strongly suggests that she is destined to suffer grave torture herself, punished for her rejection of faith and disbelief in the afterlife.